Nikos is currently an assistant professor at the Cyprus Institute and is part of the Samea Era Chair Group led by Professor Vangelis Harmandaris. He holds a PhD in Applied Mathematics from MIT and a BSc in Applied Mathematics, Engineering and Physics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Prior to joining the Cyprus Institute, he held a tenured lectureship at the School of Mathematics at Cardiff University, having previously been a postdoctoral research associate at the Chemical Engineering Department of Imperial College London and a visiting scholar at ULB. His research interests lie at the interface between applied mathematics and theoretical engineering, with particular focus on multiscale flows pertaining to wetting hydrodynamics. Much of his work to date combines analytical and computational approaches in order to elucidate the influence of substrate heterogeneities and other complexities on contact line dynamics and how these may be used in controlling the actuation of droplets in applications. Through his participation in the Center of Excellence RAISE, he is currently involved in exploring the use of data-driven methodologies for developing surrogate models that may be used in expediting the simulation of wetting phenomena. Nikos, thank you very much for joining us today. We look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Kati, for the introduction. And thank you all for being present to my presentation. So today I'm going to talk about contact line dynamics in heterogeneous environments. Contact line in this context refers to contact line dynamics, rather. Refers to the motion of the junction of three phases. For example, when we have two immiscible fluids meeting on a surface, the contact line is a line that is formed when these three phases meet. And the heterogeneous environments refer to any changes or complexities that are present in these three phases that alter the way droplets behave. So as a prototypical example of a contact line that moves on a surface is that of a drop. So let me just change. So why are we interested in these problems? Well, the motivation primarily stems from applications across both environmental applications, technological, industrial, and so on. So, for example, in industry, it's applied in pesticide deposition, coating processes, and weighting agents. In technology, we're looking at inkjet printing technologies, microfluidic and light-on chip devices. So, for example, here, this is taken from the MIT Media Lab, where they use electric fields to actuate and control how the droplets move on these surfaces. So they can very controllably move them around, merge them, mix droplets together, and so on, which can find applications in, for example, in biomedical experiments. The figure in the middle is taken from the lab in the University of Toronto, where they use this microfluidic device in order to grow mammalian cell cultures. And the figure on the right is essentially a schematic of a DNA microarray for DNA analysis. For example, in display technologies, it has been recently patented how one can use, for example, liquid lenses and apply electric fields so that one can alter the focal length and the focal properties of the lens. And this can be leveraged in display technologies. In terms of surface design, we are looking at surface cleaning. So this is a self-cleaning surface where we see a droplet that rolls on the surface can collect dust particles as it moves. And this is a silicon wafer, which undergoes a meticulous cleaning processes prior to the fabrication of our electronic devices. In addition to that, we have waterproofing, which is important, which we try to mimic nature and the excellent water repelling properties of plant leaves. Also in water harvesting, here we show an experiment from 2016 where they have shown that surfaces decorated with features promote the condensation and collection of water. So this can be used in water harvesting, for example. In energy applications, it has been applied in oil recovery. and fuel cells, and also mechanical energy harvesting. So here I'm showing a recent patent where they use microfluidic chambers built into the soles of a shoe, and through the mechanical vibrations that occur during walking, one can actuate droplets within the chambers to convert the mechanical energy to electrical energy. And through this, there's a battery in there, and then you can power, I don't know, a flashlight or charge your phone while walking. Okay, so there are lots of applications that can be that we can look at, but we are also interested in fundamental aspects. So central to wetting phenomena is the concept of a contact angle, which is formed precisely along the contact line. So as the contact angle increases from 0 degrees, the fully wetting regime, where, for example, we have this can occur, for example, if we have silicone oil on a glass plate, and all the way to 180 degrees, where we have the non-wetting regime. So there's a breadth of angles going from hydrophilic to hydrophobic angles. So this angle has been known since the 1800s. So this angle is specific for the liquids and substrates that meet along the contact line. It is determined by the thermomolecular forces, but there can be local variations due to chemical heterogeneities. And you can alter these angles by other effects. So for example, if you apply electric fields, it is known that these angles tend to be reduced, okay? In a dynamic setting, there's also the concept of contact angle hysteresis, where one typically observes that contact line does not smoothly move on a surface, but it undergoes pinning and depinning events. And this is due to the defects on the surface. And this is a manifestation of small scale defects altering the macro scale behavior of the drop. And an important message is that the hysteresis, although it is ubiquitous, and we always see this in experiments, it is still poorly understood because the coupling of these all the scales that are present in the problem has not been achieved to date. So as I alluded to previously, this is a multi-scale problem. So what we look at with the naked eye is the macro scale region of the order of millimeters. So this makes up the bulk of the drop. And if one wants to do CFD simulations, for example, one question is, what is the appropriate boundary condition to use? So today there's no widely accepted boundary condition to use for these kind of problems. All right, so so to understand why this is the case, we need to start zooming into the contact line region. So for example, in the mesoscale region, the order of microns, that's the intermediate region, we have the competition of viscosity and capillarity, and you observe a different angle. Before we observed the apparent angle, and then now we observe different angles present. And if we keep zooming into the contact line region, even at molecular scales, we have out of equilibrium physics that manifest themselves at these scales. And we see that these effects ultimately alter how the large scale droplet behaves. Okay, so one of the major challenges in this class of phenomena is bridging this disparity of scales. So what we want to do is to introduce some model for the vicinity of the contact line and understand how this manifests itself at the macro scale. And ultimately, you want to use it in macroscopic simulations by matching the hydrodynamic part of the problem to the macroscopic neighborhood of the problem through the use of an appropriate boundary condition. Okay, so the reason why macro scale laws are inapplicable in the context of wetting phenomena can be seen with this simple thought experiment of having a liquid displacing. So we have a fluid 1 and fluid 2, which are immiscible, and we have the first fluid moving with velocity v along the surface. Okay, typically under the classical fluid dynamics description, we impose a no-slip boundary condition, but you can immediately see that there's an incompatibility of the point right at the contact point. okay? Because it must simultaneously satisfy the no-slip condition and also move with a certain velocity v. In fact, mathematically, this means that if you look at the pressure, it goes like 1/x. And if you integrate the pressure to get the forces, you get logarithmically diverging forces as you approach the contact line. So this led to the famous paradox of Hugh and Scriben, which said that the total force exerted on the solid surface is logarithmically singular, logarithmically infinite, and not even Heracles could sink a solid if the physical model were entirely valid, which is not. So this means that there is some missing physics that need to be accounted for in order to properly have a contact line moving. Okay, so how do we how to introduce these missing physics? One easy one is to introduce some slip on the surface. So slip models have been the first ones to be used. They have also been observed in some experiments and also in molecular dynamics simulations. And here you introduce some scale lambda that typically multiplies the tangential viscous stresses on the surface. Okay. Another approach is to use precursor field models, which assume that ahead of the drop or ahead of the contact line, there's a thin layer of liquid of thickness epsilon, which is molecularly small. And this supposedly accounts for short-range repulsion and long-range attraction forces through the presence of a disjoining pressure. So this has been also observed in experiments with certain liquids where you see a long foot ahead of the drop if you zoom in closely enough to the contact line. Another approach, which is primarily numerically facilitated, is to have a diffuse interface. So this occurs naturally in direct numerical simulations. So you have an interface of thickness delta, where material properties change from one to the other, not in a discontinuous manner, but in a smooth manner. And if this happens, then we can have slip occurring almost exclusively near the interface region. Of course, since this is not physically introduced into the model, but this is mostly a numerical artifact. This, of course, does not take into account thermal fluctuations and other effects. Okay, but the common feature of all these approaches is the presence of a characteristic length scale, which is set by the macroscopic effects. Okay, so so in order to have motion of a contact line, we need to have a small length scale that facilitates this motion. So if we want to simulate contact lines, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of several attempts in the literature, but which is by no means exhaustive because it's a huge literature on the subject. And I'm surely not doing justice to all the efforts of the people that contributed to this. So usually people use DNS, direct numerical simulations, using the volume of fluid methods or phase field methods. And in these techniques, all those no slip is assumed. We do have slip effects that are observed at scale with delta x. If we say that delta x is the smallest distance between in our mesh. So for example, here I'm showing a force de-wetting problem where they use adaptive mesh refinement using the volume of fluid method to resolve the interface. Lattice Boltzmann methods, which are massively parallel, so they can scale very well. They are originally intended to capture low density ratios and mesoscale dynamics, because this is not really Navier-Stokes equation, but it's mostly for mesoscopic effects. But lately there's a proliferation of efforts trying to lift the limitations of lattice Boltzmann, for example, the low density ratios and so on, in order to extend the applicability to different contexts. In addition, there are finite element methods. These are not that popular because at each step one needs to remesh your solution the domain in order to capture the moving boundary. So although this allows us to have a sharp interface between liquid, gas, and solid, the fact that you need to remeasure at each time step can be computationally expensive, especially if you're doing a 3D simulation. An attractive alternative that has been invoked is the use of long-wave models, which generally exhibit favorable agreement with Fourier-Stokes within the domain of applicability. I'm going to talk about it later. So here I'm just showing the result of a simulation with multiple droplets with GPUs. Okay, so the take-home message from this is that, as you can see, the sizes, if we assume that the macro scale size is of order 1, that the sizes that we can resolve presently is of the order of 10 orders of magnitude difference, which is about 1,000 times or more larger than the actual resolution of length scales that we need to have in order to properly resolve contact line dynamics. Okay, so yes, so in order to make progress in this context, and primarily within the limit of long wave models, namely to be able to simulate phenomena for much smaller slip lengths, we're going to invoke asymptotic modeling. And this is based on the PhD work of my student at Cardiff University, and we had a paper that was recently published in Physics Review Fluids. So we'll be looking at the long wave approximation for droplets with mass transfer. So here we have a droplet moving on a surface. The different shades here correspond to different angles on the surface. And so we prescribe them with theta star. And we have specially prescribed non-evaporative fluxes. So we, for example, we inject or remove fluid through a syringe through the surface. We assume that we have sufficiently small droplets. This is reasonable if the droplet is not small, is small enough. So for example, if we are below the capillary length, which is about 3 millimeters for water, we can safely neglect inertia. We also neglect, we can neglect gravity. We also neglect inertia because we discard the stages of impact. So we assume that the droplet is deposited and we watch it, monitor its evolution. And the key assumption of the long wave approximation is that all these terms are small compared to the other terms in the equation. So this means that the fluid motion occurs primarily along the XY plane rather than across. Okay. Of course, in the continuity equation, we need to keep the derivative of the vertical velocity with respect to z because it balances the divergence of the velocity field in the XY plane. Okay, so in order to proceed and relax the stress singularity, we also assume the presence of slip, which is not particularly limiting, as we are going to see later on. So if we do all this, take these equations, the remaining terms, and put them together and use the appropriate boundary conditions, we end up with a governing equation for the evolution of the thickness h. Okay, so instead of solving for velocities, pressures, and the surface profiles, the interface, the liquid-gas interface, for example, we only have an evolution equation for h. Okay, so this is a fourth-order partial differential equation. It's a free boundary problem. So in order to solve it, we need to have zero thickness on the contact line. We prescribe the contact angle. And we have a kinematic boundary condition to allow the evolution of the contact line. So we take the velocity, the fluid velocity along C, along the contact line, and we assume that it stays there for all times. And if we do a local expansion of the PDE, we end up with this kinematic boundary condition for the droplet. An important thing to note is that with this model, here we have H that vanishes at the contact line times something which must diverge in order to balance the vanishing H, and so that we get a finite number, a finite value for the velocity. Of course, this can be done, but it is numerically tedious because we need to have a diverging pressure. The pressure scales with the Laplacian of H. Okay, so we have a diverging pressure. In order to alleviate this, we slightly modify the slip law and the model for the slip. And by doing this change here, this removes the h that was multiplying the gradient of the pressure before, and we get something that is well-defined and finite. Although this may seem a drastic change, this actually does not alter neither quantitatively nor qualitatively the dynamics. So the dynamics can be shown even rigorously that they can map to each other with very high accuracy. Okay, so these are the boundary conditions that we have, and there is no need to impose any velocity contact angle relation, and these conditions ensure compatibility with the volume constraint of the problem. So this is the problem that we are dealing with at the moment. So to make progress, we are going to be using matched asymptotics. So we treat the problem separately in regions where slip effects are not important. So this is the back of the fluid of the drop. So you can imagine a huge drop sitting on this surface here. So in the outer region, slip effects are not important. But within the inner region, which is close to the contact line, slip effects are really important. So the idea is to obtain the solution in each of these two regions separately and match them within an appropriate intermediate region to obtain the evolution of the contact line. So the aim is to turn a free boundary stiff PDE to a non-stiff evolution equation for the contact line shape. Okay, so this is the approach that we're following. So how do we do this? So first of all, we have a moving coordinate system centered at XC, YC. And we have the radius of so this is the radius, for example, of the contact line expanded in terms of its Fourier harmonics. So what we want to do is obtain evolution equations for the harmonics and the positions of this moving coordinate system in the limit as we turn lambda to 0, which is a desirable limit because lambda should be approaching 0. But of course should be non-zero, otherwise we have the non-slip condition, we have all these issues that we described before. Of course, in order to make progress, we need to introduce some assumptions. First is that the radius varies of length scales that are much larger than slip. We have a nearly circular contact line, so that the axisymmetric component is much larger than the azimuthal components, which are order delta, and delta is some smallness parameter that we introduce. We assume that you have slow motion and mass transfer, so that the time the rate of change of the harmonics matches with the harmonics of the mass flux. And for simplicity, we assume that the flux vanishes on the contact line. Okay, so we introduce some coordinate transformation that takes us from the unit disk to the irregularly shaped contact line, and we fix the centroid of we fix XCYC to be at the centroid of the wetted area. Okay, and if we do that, it means that at leading order, the first harmonic should vanish. Okay, so these are some technicalities that we are looking at the distinguished limit of long timescales, which again, we cannot capture impact effects, for example. So, and we anticipate these timescales, these scalings for the velocities and the harmonics, and we want to pursue an asymptotic expansion up to delta epsilon square terms. Okay, so bear with me, just a couple of slides of math. So first of all, we need to, as I said before, we need to look at inner and outer solutions and match the two solutions, to obtain equations for the velocity of the contact line. So what we do for the inner region, we first introduce a stretching transformation. So by making this change of variable, so you go from the x, which is a actual variable, to z, to zeta and c, which are the microscale variables. This means that we essentially zoom into the contact line region. And if we zoom sufficiently close to the contact line region, what we see is just a wedge solution. So y epsilon equals to c is a wedge solution which satisfies the contact angle condition. then we assume that things are happening slowly. So we can write that at leading order, our solution is a wedge solution plus some disturbance, which we need to determine. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but in the end, we find that the slope of the surface of the drop as we move from the inner region towards the bulk has this term, which is of course a static contact angle, plus a logarithmically diverging term as we move towards the bulk of the drop. Okay, so we want to do the same for the outer region, namely start from the bulk and move towards the contact line. Okay, so this is a bit the more complicated stuff. 2 more slides. So in the outer region, sleep is not important. So we can turn off the sleep that was previously here, and we end up with this equation. Again, we do quasi-static expansion, namely we write H naught, which does not depend on time explicitly, but it depends on time implicitly through the dependence on the contact line position, right? And then we add some other terms that appear linearly in this equation. Okay, so at leading order, we get the Poisson equation with 0 conditions on the boundary. D is the boundary, boundary of the wetted area. And the integral of this is equal to the volume. Okay, so although we can obtain the solutions to this problem perturbatively, so for example, you can use separation of variables in the limit of weakly distorted contact lines, we can also obtain this quite efficiently using the boundary integral method. The term that gave us most trouble was the next order correction. And once we get the next order correction, we can actually do the matching. So just outlining here what happens maybe in 30 pages of algebra is the fact that we have an equation of this form to solve. We are not interested in the solution of this equation, but we are interested in how the slope of the solution behaves as we approach the contact line. So what we do is to replace this term over here with its corresponding terms, where these L bars and L tildes correspond to deduce looking differential operators. Here, this term basically captures a leading order axisymmetric centroid motion. This term over here captures how the azimuthal disturbances behave, whereas this term here captures the impact of the centroid motion and the spreading motion on the azimuthal disturbances. Okay, and if we do this, we end up with this difficult looking, complex looking expression, where we can see, for example, these betas and gammas appearing, and these v's. The v's corresponds to the rate of change of the harmonics. The betas correspond to solving this problem equal to the corresponding solution to this and that. Then the blue terms are captured by the azimuthal disturbances, and the orange terms are captured by the influence of the centroid motion on the azimuthal disturbances. So what do I mean by these terms here? Well, we need to compute all these terms, store their values, and use them in simulations. Okay, so basically I needed to solve for this problem maybe 1,000 boundary value problems in order to obtain these parameters. But this is an effort that you only do once, and you store these parameters and you just retrieve them whenever you need them in a simulation. Okay, so maybe that's the last equation that you're going to see. So if you will match the cubes of the inner and outer solutions, so why matching the cubes is appropriate here can be explained in other works. I don't want to bother you with the reasoning. You can see that if you do this, these logarithmically diverging terms with respect to R, they can cancel each other out. So basically set the cube of the inner solution, the cube of the outer solution, they match, and then you can eliminate these logarithmically dependent singular terms, and you end up with this equation for the evolution of the contact line. So this is called a generalized Cox-Voronov law. I should know that this expands, improves, I would say, considerably the solution by Lacy, which was offered in the 80s, with these additional terms here. Another important remark is that we can actually consider different kinds of contact line models if we just replace, for example, lambda here with the other microscale of a different problem. So for example, if we are using a precursor film model where we have a thin layer of liquid ahead of the droplet, you can replace lambda with a multiple of the thickness of the precursor layer. And precisely this numerical multiple can be obtained through analysis in the limit of lambda and epsilon going to 0. And I should note also that this also extends the work that I have done in 2019 by adding these additional orange terms, which are a bit more difficult to compute, but these are able to capture effects of changing volume. Okay, so how do we solve this problem? We're using 3 different approaches. The first one, we solve the full governing PDE and conditions. We are using pseudospectral collocation in space, method of lines for time stepping, and you can see that the problem becomes increasingly stiff as lambda goes to 0. So this means that we need to use smaller and smaller time step as we take lambda to smaller sizes. Another approach to solve this is to solve the reduced problem, where you are going to be using these equations that we obtain here. And the apparent angle, which appears here, is to be obtained perturbatively from the solution to this equation. In fact, if we solve this problem perturbatively, we obtain this simple expression for the apparent angle. And the hybrid system requires obtaining the exact solution, obtaining the solution, the apparent angle, by solving this problem in a numerical manner. So we do not use any perturbation. Okay, so we want to assess how well these approaches perform. The first simulation here shows a droplet of constant volume, which migrates from a less hydrophilic, which is a darker shaded region, to a more hydrophilic, which is a lighter shaded region. So we see that the droplet moves along the corner over here, and we want to assess how well we can capture the dynamics with this work that we have done. First of all, here I'm showing some snapshots of the evolution at different times, and we see that if we just include the model from Lacy in the 80s, we see that there's a huge discrepancy in the way the droplet behaves, and actually we see that the droplet moves considerably faster than it should. And the white is the PD, and the green is the predictions of this Lacy's model. Now, if we add the terms that were described in the earlier contribution in JFM, my earlier paper, we see that this agreement improves considerably. So now we see nearly perfect match, although we see some slight discrepancies at intermediate steps. But if we include the additional terms that we have computed in this new contribution, we see that the agreement now becomes nearly perfect. Okay, so we have gone through the trouble of developing this model, which appears to perform well. The question is what's the benefit? Well, the gain in computational resources required is tremendous. So you can actually simulate this within a minute or two on your computer, on your laptop even, and this code is actually made available on GitHub in this physics review fluids paper. Whereas if you want to simulate the full PD, it can take a couple of days on a supercomputer. So you need much more computational effort to resolve these dynamics. And importantly, if you even decrease lambda further, the computational overhead of the full PDE increases considerably, unlike this model, which is no longer stiff and can be easily simulated. Okay. So this I'm showing a case where we have a linear outflow. So we have a droplet that loses mass in a linear fashion. We see that the hybrid model performs quite well, and it perfectly matches the behavior of the PDE, unlike the reduced model, which mistimes sometimes the dynamics, but it is still able to capture the dynamics quite accurately. So if you let this go long enough, you will see that it will completely trace the PDE solution. Okay, so over here I'm actually showing both the solution to the PDE and the hybrid model, and there's no both of them are indistinguishable from one another. So the next example shows the importance of the injection point. So the darker regions are wettability barriers, and we see that if we inject liquid closer to the wettability barrier, it can assist the droplet to overcome it and spill on the more wettable regions. And another important thing is that, again, we see very good agreement. I would say excellent agreement between the numerics and the and our model. And importantly, if you can see, the droplet is not really nearly circular as we assumed originally, which means that even that our model can be used in cases where the droplet is no longer is not needed to be circular. This other example here shows pumping in and out liquid out of a drop. Because of the size of the features, doing this with full numerics would be quite prohibitive, because you will need very dense meshes in order to resolve this, which will make this much more expensive computationally, whereas we can simulate this much more efficiently with our model. And what we observe is actually quite comparable to experimental observations made by Lam a few years ago. So this is the experiments, and that's our numerics, and we see reasonable agreement. Okay, so these methods can actually be used in other contexts. So far, for example, we have done the constant mass and the prescribed mass flux. At the moment, we are working on a publication for when we have evaporation in pure vapor atmosphere, and we have also developed the models for rough surfaces and rivulets as well. So here for the evaporation case, the mass flux is maximized at the contact line. Before, we assume that it is zero at the contact line, whereas when we have evaporation, the mass flux is maximum at the contact line. And here we show that the weaker evaporation effects makes the droplet sense the surroundings more strongly. And here we see a snapping event that occurs with the droplet shifting to the right before evaporating, unlike the stronger evaporation rates where the droplet evaporated where it was placed. So this observation was also made recently in some experimental efforts. Next, I'm going to talk about the data-driven approach, which is pursued with Andreas Dimu within the Center of Excellence RACE, which basically pursues AI methods for engineering applications towards exascale. And wetting hydrodynamics is one of the use cases pursued. So what we want to do here is we want to use simulation data from which we get the evolution of the contact line. And what we want to do is obtain in data-driven manner surrogate low-order models for the evolution of the contact line. We know how we did it for the through analysis in the limit of small contact angles. And now we want to understand how and if we are able to do this in a data-driven manner and as we increase the contact line, so that we can lift the contact angle limitation of our analytical model. So this will allow us to more efficiently generate data, and this will ultimately be used in informing the design of features in different applications. So for this purpose, to assess the capacity of AI methods to be used in this context, we're actually be cheating at the moment, and we're going to be using this low dimensional model that we have obtained through analysis as a means to assess the models. And now at the moment, we are generating CFD data sets that are going to be deployed on these models. So what we want to do, basically, we want to use the so-called Fourier neural operator, which has been proposed by Lee, which is in Kumar's group in the University of Berkeley. And basically want to learn the contact line dynamics in a data-driven manner by trying to find a mapping of this form. We take the auxiliary data, which means initial conditions, surface profiles, parameters of the problem, and we want the mapping to a solution. So the key idea is that these operators can directly learn the solutions to the entire families of PDEs. And we want to build an approximation to this operator by using this parametric map here. Okay, so here the sigmas are the activation functions, the W's are local linear operators, essentially matrices. The KNs are nonlinear integral kernel operators, essentially convolutions. P is a lifting operator that lifts our data to a higher space, higher dimension, and Q is a projection operator that takes us back to the solution space. So in the context of FNOs, the key idea is that these non-local integral kernel operators are directly obtained in Fourier space. So we know that in Fourier space, a convolution becomes a product of the Fourier transforms. So essentially, this is what we do within a Fourier layer. So we apply basically L Fourier layers and a projection and a lifting operator. So schematically, this is how it looks: projection for L Fourier layers, and then project back to the solution space. And within a Fourier layer, this is what they do. This is what we do. We take the input, we Fourier transform it, we multiply by another matrix. We invert the Fourier transform, and then we superimpose it with a linear transformation of the input data. We pass it through the activation function, and we get the output. Okay, so we basically use PyTorch and Horovod for training, and we found that 4 Fourier layers is typically sufficient for our purposes. And we can live to a higher dimensional space. If we do this, this facilitates capturing the non-local features of this mapping, because this can be a complex mapping if we are to learn parameter families of the solutions to PDEs. So we are going to be invoking 2 methods. The first one is purely data-driven. So what we want to do is, given the solution at 9 previous steps, predict the solution at the following step. Okay, where n here is used to denote some realization of the system. So we have, we know the contact line shape, the radius, the centroid, and the local contact angle. So for training, we use 100 time steps for training, taken from about 800 simulations with random initial conditions and heterogeneities. And for validation, we basically, for 200 unseen surface profiles, we start from this initial data, and then we apply the network over and over to predict subsequently all solutions, okay, up to time equal to 100. So this is the average cumulative error over all simulation steps. So this is done with constant learning rate. So we did different things. We looked at stripes and random features. And also we looked at a 2-dimensional model, which means that we, instead of looking at 1-dimensional curves, we looked at 2-dimensional images, you want to call them as such, where we had zeros inside, zeros outside the drop and ones inside the drop. And we tried to see how well this performed. And also we looked at the superposition of stripes and noise, looking at the 1-dimensional model that we had. So if we try the network that we trained on different surfaces, we see that it performs okay for different patterns. So this is a dartboard pattern. We see that it can can capture accurately enough the contact line dynamics, although we see some that the curves are not as smooth as the solution. So this is also evident here, where we have just a gradient along the x direction. But I should emphasize here that this network was trained on random features. So that's why this explains why we see these kind of behaviors. And also on a striped surface, again, we don't see perfect agreement, but I would say that the agreement is acceptable. The conclusion with this first approach is that it works generally well, provided that the unseen surface samples are drawn from the same distribution as the training datasets. One of the key drawbacks is that it needs solutions at 10 previous time steps to get started, which means essentially that you need to perform about a 10th of the simulation before you can use this. And even if you do this, there are cases where you see this jittering dynamics, which means that it is difficult to generalize this approach for arbitrary surfaces. And another drawback is that the solution needs to be predicted at fixed steps, which must be sufficiently far apart and not too far apart. Otherwise, the network will not learn anything. Okay. So then we try to use a different approach. In which we use an AI augmented model. We basically use similar ideas explored without FNOs, but with fully connected layers by Wan and Sapsis in JFM 2018, when they looked at bubbles in a fluid. And what we would do here is basically we have the contact line velocity on the left-hand side. We add the inaccurate model that was done in the 80s, as I said before, and we augment this model with an AI part. Okay, so this is a low accuracy superposition of a low accuracy model and an AI-driven model. Of course, you can replace the AI-driven, the low accuracy surrogate model with, for example, a low resolution simulation. For example, this could be also acceptable, provided that you modify appropriately this method. So the pros and cons, it is more straightforward to generalize because you see that the theta star is already taken into account by the surrogate model, the low order model. We can also obtain the solution at intermediate step. That's another plus. But on the minus side is that we need to have a knowledge of such a model in order to hope to be able to do something with it. And that the solution of the AI augmented model may be prone to numerical instabilities. So some non-smooth results given by the AI part may actually give rise to instabilities in your solution. Here, this is the training and validation we have done. We use a much smaller training set, 480 simulations on a variety of surfaces, and we evaluate the contact line velocity at random times. Okay, so because time does not appear explicitly in this context. And for validation, we used different surfaces and we evaluate the velocity at 12,000 times. Here, this is the training and validation errors, and with a variable learning rate. Okay, so this is coming to an end. So these are the results. So without the AI, this is what we get. The reference is the blue curves, and without the AI, so this is the model of the 80s from Lacey. We see that does not perform well at all. And if we add the AI part, we recover a very good agreement. I would say excellent agreement with the simulation. Again, if we use, that's another example. Here we have another example where we have a gradient which is unseen in the training part. So none of these cases were seen in the training phase. So we have a droplet that migrates towards the left. And we have also a checkerboard pattern to make things a bit more interesting. And again, we see that as time goes by, the surrogate model without the AI becomes progressively worse. But if we add the AI, we recover very good agreement. The important thing to note here is that how well this model performs is crucial on what kind of situations it sees. So how the variety of behaviors that are present in the training set. For example, if you don't see, if the training set does not see a droplet that makes long excursions from its initial position, it may undermine the effect of the centroid motion in the dynamics. For comparison, if we were to apply the first approach of the FNO that I described earlier, agreement tends to be good up to about this point, and from that point on, it becomes completely off. Okay, so it means that the second approach that we have adopted is actually a better idea. So in conclusion, so these are some key highlights. We saw that match asymptotics are able to obtain accurate and efficient models for the conduct line dynamics. And we saw that the hybrid approach works the best. The dynamics is captured at the fraction of the computing resources compared to the full PDE. But it is important to lift the limitations of analytical and simulation approaches with data-driven methodologies. For example, if we add other complexities to the conduct line dynamics, this analytical approach becomes increasingly intractable. And this data-driven approach that we have proposed actually appears to be a viable alternative to produce accurate models. Part of the ongoing and future work, we have first the results on evaporative mass fluxes, which are shown before, which are underway. We want to generalize this framework to capture other effects. We are about to start to perform hyperparameter tuning to optimize the features of the network so that it performs the best. In another development, we're also going to start with Vangelis Harmandaris to model droplets on surfaces using ND simulations. And we want also to go beyond the long wave limit and by applying these AI methods to CFD simulations. So, and some of the projects that have been enabled through the CIMEA project is the RAISE COE that I have talked about, where we combine AI tools and simulation. And we also have, and this is in collaboration with the University of Iceland. We have also the Engage Marie Curie co-fund, which combines also modeling and MD simulations. So this is collaboration with, again, Vangelis and Markus Müller from the University of Göttingen. And lastly, we have a proposal funded by the Research Innovation Foundation for an excellence hub, where we are going to extend all these methodologies, both on the CFD front and the analytical and the AI front. And with that, I want to make some shameless advertisement for a PhD studentship and a postdoctoral position. And if you're interested, please get in touch. And that's a final slide with acknowledgements, and I'm happy to take your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikos. That was a lovely presentation. If people do have questions, please raise your hands and we'll work through them in that way. Vangeli, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. Thank you very much, Nikos. It was very interesting, all this discussion. You actually tried to describe many different subjects. So just a couple of, let's say, very generic questions. So the first one is, starting from the last part, as you say, one of the ideas and the goals is to couple, let's say, with the molecular level. So what kind of information would be more relevant for these models? I assume the sleep length would be one. But in general, I mean, if we want to incorporate, let's say, specific molecular detail.
Yes. So, for example, if we have well, the project within the Engage project tries to look at surfaces that are made of polymers. So polymer surfaces, they have some mechanical properties like, want to have the elasticity constants, the Young modulus, the Poisson ratios, and all that stuff. And because the contact line will also deform the surface, typically the contact line pulls the surface there. It also relies on having an accurate description of what happens at these scales.
You're right about that, but I was thinking more about the coupling. So let's say which parameters of the model need to be derived from the molecular scale. Let's say that we calculate the slip length or the contact number. Is this enough, or do we need something more?
Well, the main challenge is to come up with some constitutive law that allows us to look at these complex surfaces. If the surface is perfectly flat and homogeneous, maybe the classical approaches can be adequate. But if you have these complex surfaces, we will need some constitutive relation that we are presently missing. And this is what we aim, hopefully, to get through this.
And then you're right. And then a follow-up, when we have a non-Newtonian fluid or viscoelastic, should we somehow incorporate viscoelastic effects?
Yes, I mean, ideally, if we, yes. So, if we manage to go through this path and it is successful, of course, it is.
Is it tractable to derive a model with viscoelastic using memory kernel, for example, in your derivation, or is not realistic?
Well, it depends on the complexity. I guess we need to put some simplifying assumptions. Otherwise, I understand things can be quite complicated at the molecular scales.
Okay. And if I can one more, in the last part, it's not clear to me what's the predictive capability, let's say, of this model. So, for example, if you have a case where the training data set is derived from a specific part of the heterogeneous interface, the surface, actually.
Yes.
So do you expect that the model would predict the behavior of the droplet in the other part of the substrate?
Yes. If we follow the first approach, the answer is no. So it strongly depends on what kind of data it sees, what kind of heterogeneity profiles it sees. Whereas for the other approach, where I'm showing here the results, basically what we need is a sufficiently wide, a data set that exhibit sufficiently wide behaviors. So, for example, if you provide the data set where the droplet just spreads symmetrically about the origin, if you put it on a testing data set, you won't see, for example, things like that. But if you are able to incorporate these kind of behaviors, the system is pretty much agnostic to the heterogeneity profiles of the contact line, and it works. It works well. Yeah.
But that depends on the specific problem, right?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yannis, please go ahead.
Hello. Thank you for the very nice presentation. I have a question related to the disjoining pressure and the weighting phenomena you talked about. You mentioned
okay.
In the presentation. Are you aware of any studies that relate the disjoining pressure and the weighting to the thermodynamic state of the substrate? For example, how the thermodynamic state of the substrate affects the weighting phenomena, if it is crystalline or amorphous, for example.
Well, I haven't looked at this part of the literature. Usually, the way that this is modeled is you augment basically the usual curvature term with a dejoining pressure that incorporates the repulsion and attraction of the liquid layer on the surface. So basically, you add. So you have van der Waals 1/h³, for example, terms and the repulsion term and so on, and this is basically used to maintain a molecularly thin layer of liquid on the surface. But in the case where you have these complexities, I haven't really looked into this part of the literature, but yeah, maybe people have looked into this. So what do you expect to see in that case, for example?
Well, for example, I am aware of MD simulations that relate, for example, a repulsive substrate, crystalline, affects the slip conditions, or and this changes whether the substrate is amorphous, for example. But this depends, of course, of whether it is weakly attractive or repulsive, the substrate. So some atomistic simulations can shed light on this.
Yes, I think this will be interesting to look into. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Panayota, please go ahead.
Hi, Nikos. Thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. Really enjoyed it. I was going to ask about how the electric field affects the wedding hydrodynamics. You could elaborate more on that. Is it something you worked on?
Yes, so the influence of electric fields is part of the work that is going to be explored within the Excellence Hubs. So how it works, let me just go at the beginning where we have a schematic of a drop. So basically, let's look at this configuration. For example, typically you put a dielectric, you coat the surface with a dielectric. The droplet is usually conducting, okay, and then you apply electric fields, and due to the attraction of the of the charge attraction, then there are Maxwell stresses that are generated on the free surfaces that attract the liquid on the electrode. So if you have an electrode at the bottom, dielectric in the middle, and the conducting liquid drop on top, and then you apply electricity to it, then due to these Maxwell stresses, the liquid will be attracted to the electrode below, and the droplet will spread. Okay, and then this will reduce the contact angle. And a resolved challenge in this context is what happens if you keep increasing the voltage. If you go above one critical value for the voltage, the contact angle here no longer reduces, and this is not presently explained well in the literature. So there's no mechanism for this, why this occurs.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks a lot.
Anastasia, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Nikos. Very nice talk. Just in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the different approaches, and okay, you tell to us a lot about this continuum approach, which is based on PDEs, but you said something about a discretization method, which is possible to be applied. What is the idea behind this discretization, and which is the focus of this method?
I'm not sure what you're referring to. Maybe you can point me to. You're talking about here.
Before, I think you said that you also work on another approach based on different discretization, but you didn't say a lot, I think, about it.
I'm not sure what this refers to.
Here, Boltzmann methods, yeah, finite.
Yes. So these are different approaches to simulate fluid fluid dynamics. So the volume of fluid methods are typically better at capturing moving interfaces, especially when you have high density ratios. Phase field methods are also being used. So depending on what method each group is trained, so they have their method of choice. There's no good or bad method to choose. But when we approach these problems using simulation, we need to be aware of the limitations. So as I said before, lattice Boltzmann is primarily targeting mesoscale effects.
Okay.
So you cannot look at large droplets. So typically the droplets should be quite small for these methods to be applicable. But still, I mean, as I said before, there's a disparity of length scales of, if you look at this slide, going from millimeters to nanometers or smaller, then there's a 10 to the 6 order of magnitude disparity of scales. And here, numerical simulations typically do not go beyond 10 to the -3. So there is a lot of distance to cover until then. And we are hoping that through getting some information by MD simulations, we hope to help bridge a bit this disparity of scales.
Okay. So this part was based on, the part that I referred to was based on the lattice Boltzmann methods.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Panayota, your hand is still raised. I don't know if that was from your previous question or if you have another one.
Oh, actually, I forgot it, but another question came to mind. If you, Nikos, if you get any pinching phenomena where, let's say, you've got the striped substrate and your droplet moves over that, and then if it separates into two, or if
yeah, so it did. So this is a limitation of this approach, because it assumes that no such things occur. So the droplet remains intact while spreading. So there are different ways to try to do this, but I would imagine that maybe we would need the assistance of both full simulations and some data-driven models in order to capture this using a low order model, a surrogate model. For example, even with the model that we employ here, cannot easily apply. You cannot easily have the separation of the droplet into two parts. Because you have, the way you discretize a problem makes it really hard to do this. And if you want to study such phenomena, the way forward is to replace the slip model with a disjoining partial model, which will allow you to do this splitting and merging of droplets much more easily. And then you can generate the data sets, and through the generation of data sets, maybe you can have some hope in deducing some surrogate model through a data in a data-driven manner.
Thanks a lot.
Are there any other questions? People can just unmute their microphones if you want to ask something.
Nico, just as let's say last point. So how far did you go with examining different heterogeneities on the surfaces? Did you play a lot there?
Meaning?
For example, is it possible to incorporate heterogeneities on the third dimension as well?
On the third dimension?
Yeah, if you consider a surface.
Oh, you mean if you have a rough surface, like yeah.
But with a large roughness, let's say.
Well, not large roughness, because then you have other issues. One thing that can happen is, for example, the features of the surface may perforate the free surface, and this cannot be captured by, you don't have chance with analysis. You have to do full numerics for that purpose. But still, even numerical, full DNS computations typically do not have small scale features in their simulations for this to happen. Maybe, the size of the features of the surface are comparable, maybe 10 times less than the diameter of the drop.
Now that's interesting, because it sets up, let's say, the relevant length scales. since this exactly as you described, it's an inherent, let's say, multiscale problem.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
Are there any other questions?
Yeah, if I could ask, I'm not sure how to raise the hand. Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes.
can. Please go ahead.
Excellent. I'm not sure I understood that part, but do you have any flexibility in choosing the, let's say, what kind of fluid it is? Because in principle, my question is more related, let's say, to a polymeric fluid, because in that case, it would be related to the 3D printing, for example. So do you have any, let's say, any control over the properties of the fluid? So is it some kind of a parameter?
Well, this will change if you add. Well, okay, let me go back to the. Okay, so to this equation here. So if, for example, you have viscoelastic fluids and so on, then you need to replace these terms over here with some other components. So this assumes that you have a Newtonian fluid, which is somewhat viscous, but it can also be applicable in water, but it shouldn't be. So this assumes the presence of a Newtonian fluid. So if you have a different constitutive law governing the fluid, then of course this equation changes. And one needs to redo the analysis or make changes to the way you approach things. Yeah.
But in principle, it would be possible.
Yes, in principle, it is possible. Yeah, I've seen works that look at polymeric fluids in this fashion. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions? All right. Well, Nikos, thank you very much for your time today. Thank you for your excellent presentation. And I'm wishing everyone a good afternoon ahead.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you very much, Nico.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.